All right, thank you very much, San. Really appreciate the introduction, and thanks for everybody who joined. For those who don't know me, who haven't met before, Mike Milinkovich, Executive Director of the Eclipse Foundation, a position that I've had the great honor and privilege of holding for the last 18 years. And I'm here to talk to you today about how open source is driving digital transformation, both at the micro level within your organizations, but also at the macro level in terms of how open source is impacting innovation around the world and across almost every single sector of the economy. Now, this is almost trite now because it's a meme that's been around for quite a few years, but software truly is eating the world. And when we talk about digital transformation, I think that really is part of what's happening as a result of this trend towards the major functions in products, the major innovations in products, the major features that customers care about in products are largely today being driven by software. And that, of course, is disrupting all sectors of the economy. And so one of the things we need to talk about is, why is this happening? And in particular, why is open source driving this trend? For me, I think open source is a necessary step along the journey of any organization's digital transformation. Now, ultimately, what does digital transformation really mean in the scope of an organization? And to a large degree, what it means is about taking your organization in whatever industry it might be and making it a more software-centric organization. An organization that puts software at the center of the development efforts that it undertakes for its products. And ultimately, an organization that takes on the attributes of a successful software organization. So you hear words like agility and so on, where they're really talking about how you can take some of the best practices that you see in software today and apply those to new domains, whether it be automotive, industrial automation, transportation, logistics, or whatever. And really, I think what the major trend has been in the software world over the last 15, 20 years is that open source is eating software. So if software is eating the world, open source is becoming the mechanism by which that is happening. There are no companies left that are software companies that haven't yet adopted open source as a major trend. Of course, you go back in the early days of open source, you'd hear phrases from Microsoft like "open source is communism," but now they own GitHub and have obviously embraced open source in a massive way. And you're starting to see that more and more in the products that they're shipping. So if software is eating the world, open source is eating software. And to a large degree, that is a reflection of how the underlying technologies that drive our economy and our societies today are working. Our world is based on free. Like if you think of the internet and the World Wide Web, these basic technologies upon which not only our economies, but to a large degree, our societies are based, they are based on free technologies. It's an accident of history, perhaps, but both the internet protocols, that's Vint Cerf, and the World Wide Web protocols happen to come from organizations that were motivated to put them out and make them freely available worldwide. And that's what's really driven the technology basis for our society. And I'm not really sure where I first heard this meme, but I love the idea. In that part of the reason why open source is so successful is that the mechanisms of open source are based on the very best ideas of both Adam Smith and Karl Marx. They're based on the notions of Adam Smith in that open source, because it provides free access to software components, is the ultimate free market of both ideas and of software. And the best ideas of Karl Marx in the sense that it is the ultimate democratization of production, that every single person who has the skills can participate in open source and contribute to the advancement of these open source platforms that are driving innovation today. So it's a really it's a really interesting thing to think about, that it really is both the perfect market and the democratization of production that is driving innovation forward. So of course, what that means is ideas that were once radical are now mainstream. And honestly, if anyone in the audience still thinks that open source is not mainstream, if this is not how things are being done today, hopefully by the end of this conversation, we will have moved your opinion at least a bit. And I really want to focus on this one core idea, which is that the freedom to study, modify, and freely distribute software is simply a better way to do business. And there's a huge impact that this has had, this insight has had on how innovation is happening today. So around the world, innovation is being driven by and almost in some ways invisible for those who don't really, focus on this part of it. There's this global supply chain of open source technologies and software that are really driving how innovation happens today. Most systems, cyber physical systems today, roughly 80 to 90% of the software running in them is based on open source, which is really allowing companies to focus on the value differentiators that their customers care about, and instead of building the infrastructure that they need to deliver value to their customers. So this global supply chain has really driven open source into virtually every niche in the economy in the world. So it's really hard to understate how much of an impact on the economy open source has had today. And it's really driving a lot of innovation, but it's also driving a lot of value capture. So over the last 15 years or so, the major economic winners around the world are what are companies that are sometimes referred to as the platform companies. I've heard acronyms like FANG and so on, where Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google. There's other acronyms, but the richest companies, the fastest growing companies around the world, are the companies that have captured the network effects of building out platform businesses. And almost without exception, these companies are the companies that you see embracing and participating in open source. So now, correlation is not causation, but it is very, very interesting to note that virtually every one of the big companies, the fastest growing, the most valuable companies in the world today, are companies which are basing significant amounts of their technology on open source. And that's everything from Apple using NetBSD as the basis of Mac OS, to Microsoft's continuing embrace of open source through GitHub and the likes. And we're really seeing a shifting impact of open source. When it first got started, it was really about saving cost and commoditizing technologies that were already in existence. And now what we're seeing is open source is how innovation happens. When there's major new technology trends, those trends are largely being driven by open source strategies from the companies that are trying to drive these trends. And a couple of mega trends that we see across almost all sectors of the economy today, and this is really leading to a convergence of opportunities for the next big wave of innovation. You see things like IoT and Edge Computing, machine learning and AI, cloud, distributed ledger technologies. All of those are being fundamentally led by open source. Now, I'd say industrial automation has got a huge amount of open source in it as well, but so far the Industry 4.0 crowd haven't quite cottoned on to the importance of open source and the degree that they need to push it into their strategies. But we see these major mega trends of innovation presenting a future opportunity around the machine economy, where smart machines, smart services, and smart value creation are going to create entirely new business models and entirely new opportunities for economic growth and innovation. And we see this as a huge opportunity. We've all seen these various charts over the years where people are talking about how many connected devices there are and so on. But with the machine economy opportunity, we think that there's going to be a huge transition from thinking about the platform companies as platform, and it's the sort of the internet of humans selling social networks and connectivity to humans, to a new opportunity where the connectivity of machines and the ability for machines to transact with one another at very low cost, at very low friction, those are going to create entirely new business opportunities. And we really fundamentally believe that just like the internet protocols and the World Wide Web protocols were what drove the creation of the modern world and the internet as we know it, I fundamentally believe that a similar basis of free and therefore ubiquitous technologies are really going to drive this machine economy opportunity. So let's just talk about a couple of sort of particular examples of where the machine economy might come to pass. And first one, and one that's near and dear to the heart of those of us at the Eclipse Foundation, is the transition that's happening in the automotive industry as a whole. There's a lot of different trends that are going on there. Electrification, of course, is one of them. Autonomous driving is another one. But fundamentally, how automobiles are being architected as systems is changing. Today, an automobile is a network of anywhere between 1 and 200 ECUs, engine control units, which are basically small special purpose computers that run anything from the wiper blades to the anti-lock brake system on your brakes. The future of the car is to become more of a data center, a server on wheels with a high performance CPU or multiple CPUs at the center of this, using hypervisor technologies to separate the safety critical functions from the say entertainment functions and less critical functions. But it's a fundamental rethinking that's going on right now in terms of how the computing resources on an automobile are going to be happening. And that's just really one example, because when you think about the automotive sector as a whole, autonomous driving is and to a certain degree mobility as a service. These are the kinds of things that are really leading to the data center on the wheels. But across the entire automotive sector, you've got the life cycle of a car, predictive maintenance, supply chain management, digital procurement, and so on, that are also all in their own niches driving fundamental change and digital transformation. Here at the Eclipse Foundation, we're part of the overall solution that's happening here in the automotive sector. Because of our involvement with a number of projects and working groups like Open Mobility, that's doing simulating transport applications, Open Pass, which is helping to assess autonomous driving systems, Open ADX, building autonomous driving tool chains. But most recently and most importantly, the Software Defined Vehicle initiative at the Eclipse Foundation, where tier ones and OEMs and a huge chunk of the automotive sector are coming together to build a single common platform for this data center on wheels. So, if you think about it, when you change this fundamental architecture of the car, you've got a chance to do a completely re-architecture of the software as well. Right now, for the last generation of automobiles, it's been largely driven by technologies like CAN bus. This is an opportunity to fundamentally rethink how the software and the infrastructure on an automobile, and also enabling the connected car scenarios, are going to happen. And we're very excited about the fact that companies like Bosch and Continental and ZF are banding together to think of how they can build a single shared solution for this software-defined vehicle, which is the next generation of automotive. Now, one thing I just want to make clear when I talk about the impact that open source is having is also very important to recognize that open source is complementary to open standards. And one thing I'll mention is that in the context of software-defined vehicle, and when we have other examples of this at the Eclipse Foundation as well, of course, there's a real focus on doing a code-first community where open source leads the way, but there's also a strong interest in developing specifications as part of software-defined vehicle and starting to evolve standards within the software-defined vehicle initiative as well. You know, I really think that open source and open standards are entirely complementary to one another, and I often see this false dichotomy that they're in competition with one another, but the value propositions are fundamentally different. The value propositions of open source is innovation, rapid adoption, flexibility, community engagements, open collaboration. You know, these are really what drive open source forward. Open standards, the value proposition are things like stability, interoperability, investment protection, longevity, sustainability. You know, and so open source and open standards can and are complementary to one another, and this is something that we're definitely planning on focusing very much with software-defined vehicles. But of course, we have another example that's even closer to home for this audience, which is Sparkplug. You know, this was a code-first initiative, and we have some really interesting implementations of Sparkplug that are being hosted at the Eclipse Foundation. But actually developing that as a specification and hopefully bringing that forward into becoming an ISO standard in the future really is a great example of how the Eclipse Foundation can be a home for a place where we're doing both open source and open standards. So just a few closing thoughts in terms of how your organization can participate in this sort of both macro level digital transformation and the micro level digital transformation within your own organizations. The one thing I really want to focus on or really drive home is that there are a lot of companies that are in industry and to a certain degree enterprises, which for many years have taken open source and used it effectively within their organizations. I mentioned earlier that 80 to 90% of most products these days are based on open source components. The same is true of bespoke developed applications within organizations as well. In both cases, you have a real plethora of open source program offices focused on compliance with how and mastering the art of intaking open source within the production of products within an organization. But really, I don't think any organization can claim to have completed their digital transformation journey until they've also learned how to master the art of contributing to open source and participating in the community. So I'd really like to encourage the audience that it's, I'm sure almost if you're here, then you're using open source. But I really think the next step in your journey has to be in learning how to engage with the community, contributing to projects that matter to you, and making sure that your investments are protected by getting your features into those projects. And by the way, I haven't even mentioned security yet in this talk, but of course, supply chain security and security of the open source assets is absolutely key. But it's really this engagement that's going to lead your organization to a leadership position. There's a really interesting McKinsey article about a year ago that was talking about how organizations that have learned how to contribute to open source are seeing better rates of innovation to the point where they were actually able to measure increases in brand value based on the improved innovation pace that they were getting from their participation in open source. So please consider showing leadership within the open source community and participating in these projects. And And that is really going to be a huge part of your organization's digital transformation, which effectively, or in reality, is going to be very important to the survival and flourishing of your organization as these macro level digital transformations take off around the world. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention. And hopefully there's a time here, there might even be a question or two.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mike, for the presentation. So indeed, the open source is really at the heart of digital transformation. One would question, and I think you've implied as you're closing to that important point is, what typically the major challenges that organizations face. Part of the previous surveys that we have done at the IoT and Edge Native Working Group, we typically do the developer and adoption survey every year. And by the way, for our participants who haven't yet got the chance to complete the survey, please do so. We'll be putting the survey link in the chat box in a minute. But one of the challenges that organizations face is security. So what typically open source organizations like the Eclipse Foundation and Linux Foundation and others are doing to help organizations overcome that challenge?
Well, there's a lot of work going on. So just 2 weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C. for an open SSF meeting where they were talking with a large collection of some of the leading companies and leading U.S. government organizations around the whole topic of supply chain security. And there's a number of different initiatives that are underway in order to improve security. But fundamentally, I think that the key thing to remember is that open source, people have been treating open source like it's free as in free beer, where they need to be treating it like it's free as in free puppy, in the sense that it takes some care and feeding as well. And honestly, if you are a consumer of open source and it's never occurred to you that you might want to contribute some amount of energy or time or money back to the communities and organizations from which you are drawing your open source, then you're really missing an opportunity. And it's not just this is not just altruism, right? There are, like I referenced the McKinsey study earlier, and I'd be happy to share the link later if anyone's interested. But there are tangible business wins from participating in open source in terms of improved morale, improved recruitment, improved retention, improved innovation cycles, right? There are real tangible benefits to participating. And so I think that's the biggest challenge ahead of us is really the changing of attitudes towards where all this free stuff is coming from, and how you should be engaging with the communities that support them.
Indeed. Well, thanks, Mike,